At the end of the day, the Offspring, more than anybody else, were the band that really put that style on the map for millions and millions of kids back in 1994. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about the Offspring, a band that really hasn't gotten the credit that they deserve for honestly being one of the most important bands in the entire history of punk. It's true. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't you say before that Pretty Fly for a White Guy is one of the worst songs ever made? And yes, I did say that, I do believe that, but it is still true. The Offspring did a lot for the culture. I kind of think about it this way. If Green Day were the band that put the Bay Area style of pop punk on the map, then the Offspring were that for the Southern California sound, which 30 years later has proven to be by far the more important and influential style. And if you asked most people, including the members of the band, back in 1992 or something, if this would ever happen, they would have told you that you were crazy. So the question is, how exactly did this happen? How did they go from being just really one of 1,000 fairly obscure Southern California punk bands to selling over 15 million albums? And more importantly, what is their lasting influence, legacy, and impact? And also, why haven't they really gotten the credit that they deserve? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. And also, I want to thank OneRep for sponsoring this video. OneRep is a platform that removes people's private records from over 100 people search sites and Google, which is important because what you may not realize is that people search sites like White Pages, My Life, and so forth expose your home address, phone number, information from your legal and property records, and a lot of other really sensitive data. And scammers can use that to do all kinds of things, like open credit cards and accounts in your name, file fraudulent tax returns on your behalf, and so forth. This happened to one of my business partners, and trust me, it is an absolutely awful, nightmarish experience. Those data brokers also sometimes publish inaccurate information. So for example, someone does a background check on you and someone else's criminal record shows up associated with you. So if you want to help protect yourself against all that, you can do it with a subscription to OneRep. You'll strengthen your privacy and safety, dramatically reduce the risk of falling victim to identity theft and imposter scams, cut down on spam, and just get general peace of mind. Sign up with OneRep right now and get 60% off a 1-year plan with an exclusive offer for the viewers of my channel. Just go to the link in the description of this video. We are talking only $5.85 per month if you choose to protect yourself, and $11.95 a month if you sign up your whole family. And OneRep is backed by a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you even have a trial period to see if it's right for you. So in order to answer those questions, let me start at the beginning, because the Offspring have actually been around for almost 40 years now, believe it or not. They started out way back in 1984 under the name Manic Subsidal. Not really sure what they were thinking of that one. Definitely not the world's best name. And they probably had the same thought because they changed their name in 1986 to The Offspring and put out their first album in 1989 on a label called Nemesis Records, which was really just like a small punk hardcore kind of label from Orange County that most people probably know for putting out bands like Chorus of Disapproval and Instead.
Like I'm slipping away, I can't hold on. Find that path alone. Just what's leading away.
And although they don't really get a lot of credit for it now, the band was most definitely a part of the DIY punk scene of that era. Like if you look, there are some absolutely wild flyers from back then for shows they played with bands like Final Conflict and Infest, Agnostic Front, and Fugazi. My favorite one is Neurosis and Chumbawamba at Gilman Street, and the next day it's The Offspring. But the first time I remember seeing their name was around 1992 when they signed to Epitaph and put out their second album, Ignition. Epitaph was a much smaller label back then than it is now, but they still did a lot more to market their releases than just about any other punk label. So I remember seeing a lot of ads and reviews and stuff for this album in kind of the underground press sort of circuit. But still, it really didn't catch on beyond kind of their core fan base, so I think absolutely nobody was expecting what was about to happen. The band went from being essentially unknown outside of Southern California to being literally on top of the charts almost overnight in 1994 with the release of their third album, Smash, and specifically the song Come Out and Play, which went to #1 on Billboard, and I would say is still my favorite song by The Offspring. And they proved that they were more than a one-hit wonder by following that up with Self-Esteem, which went to number 4 on Billboard, and then Gotta Get Away, which went to number 6. 3 back-to-back top 10 singles on one album. They were officially a mainstream success at this point. And before I go on, I really want to dive deep and give some context on this album and exactly why it was so important, because I think maybe people kind of sort of know this, but I've never really heard anybody talk about it. First of all, in hindsight, obviously Green Day ended up being the biggest band of that like mid-90s punk explosion, but in 1994 or 95, that was definitely not clear. At that time, I would say it was kind of like a three-way tie between Green Day, The Offspring, and Rancid. And actually, of the three, The Offspring had charted the highest by a good margin. And although, as far as I'm aware, there wasn't any sort of rivalry or anything like that between those bands, in a sense, it really was kind of a showdown between the two big styles of pop punk at the time. On the one hand, you had Green Day and Rancid representing the Bay Area Lookout Records kind of style that was centered around the venue 924 Gilman Street, with bands like Crimp Shrine, 15, Cringer, and Jawbreaker. And on the other hand, The Offspring sort of unofficially representing the Southern California sound, with the notable bands being Bad Religion, NoFX, Pennywise, Lagwagon, and so forth. And you may be saying to yourself, oh, that's interesting. Like, why have I never heard of these bands Crimp Shrine and 15? And that is exactly my point. At the time, the Bay Area scene was considered to be more credible and closer to quote unquote real punk by the, punk establishment, whoever the people are that decide those sort of things at zines like Maximum Rock and Roll. But 30 years later, it's very clear that the Southern California style has really had more staying power and is a lot more relevant and popular. And obviously Bad Religion played a big role there as well, but really at the end of the day, The Offspring, more than anybody else, were the band that really put that style on the map for millions and millions of kids back in 1994. And aside from just the impact of The Offspring themselves, the success of this album really made it possible for a whole generation of bands to succeed by changing the trajectory of Epitaph Records forever. For anybody who may not be familiar, just as a quick refresher, Epitaph was started by Brett Gurewitz, the guitarist and founder of Bad Religion, originally just to put out their albums and then kind of grew into a label that was bigger than that. And although it was certainly successful for a punk label of the early 90s, it was hardly like a big operation. They sold something like 25,000 copies of the previous Offspring album, which by today's standards would be pretty good, but back in the early 90s when people still bought physical media, that was not a lot of records. And so neither the label or the band really expected much more than that from this album. I think this interview with Dexter from 1994 really kind of sums it up. The possibility of us getting played on the radio or anything like that was pretty much non-existent, especially because this kind of music is not generally considered acceptable by the mainstream. So for something like this to happen, it really took us by surprise. Because keep in mind, at this point, there's really no evidence that punk was viable in the mainstream because this was still before Green Day had blown up, and the Offspring were still essentially a part-time band. Like, Noodles still had his job as a janitor at a high school in Anaheim. But still, after kind of taking off locally and then getting picked up on the radio all over the country, it ended up being a gigantic success. It sold over 6 million albums, and as far as I know, still stands as the best-selling indie release of all time. And with the money Epitaph made from that album, it enabled them to take chances on a lot of smaller artists like the Voodoo Glow Skulls and Agnostic Front. They put out a Tom Waits record. All these artists who they believed in creatively or for being part of the scene, but clearly nobody thought they were gonna sell millions of albums. But they could do that because of the money that they had coming in from Smash. It also helped independent record stores survive. I think Brett Gurewitz put it really well. He said that this album raised the sea level for the whole punk community. Even if you think that the Offspring were shitty poser stuff for kids who shop at the mall, this album was still the entry point for millions and millions of kids to eventually get into quote-unquote real punk. Like, how many kids heard Come Out and Play and then got into NoFX and Strung Out, and then maybe they checked out Crass and Black Flag or whatever? Or maybe they saw that the Offspring covered bands like The Digits, or later on they did a song with Jello Biafra. Personally, I can't really say that I'm a huge fan of their music, but I can definitely recognize what they did for the scene by helping so many people get into punk. With that said, as usual, the punk scene had to find a way to view somebody else's success as a negative. Of course, along with Green Day and Rancid, they were added to the list of bands that real punks had to hate. And I remember the legendary 80s Southern California punk band Agent Orange in particular got really upset because they felt like that one surf guitar kind of part from Come Out and Play was a little too similar to their song from 1981 called Bloodstains. Which I personally thought was kind of stupid because, as the Vandals pointed out in their song about it called Aging Orange, that's really just the Phrygian scale.
So after a thought and a panel of experts, I came up with a brilliant little plan. I'll take out my provisions on one of these ungrateful new punk rock bands.
But could you really expect anything else from boomer punks? In any case, regardless of whether you like this album or not, the point that I am making here is that this album was a big deal for punk. Every bit as big as Dookie. Which brings us to their next album, Ixnay On The Hombre from 1997, which put them in the kind of difficult position of having to follow up on this giant mainstream success. Everyone was wondering, could they keep the momentum going, or was that one album really all they had in them? Were they just kind of in the right place at the right time? And as history will now show, they answered that question with this album, which was kind of complicated by the fact that they left Epitaph over disputes with Brett Gurewitz. They ended up signing to Columbia Records. But in spite of all that, the album went to number 9 on Billboard, and the single Gone Away was another mainstream hit. Maybe not quite as big as Come Out and Play or Low Self-Esteem, but still a big song, and the album did go platinum and showed that they had staying power and that they were more than just a punk band. Like, I would consider Gone Away to be more of what you would call like a rock song that got picked up by a lot of radio stations that maybe wouldn't typically play a punk band. And with their continued success, they brought even more people into the scene. Which brings us to their next album, Americana, in 1998, which was arguably the peak of their mainstream relevance. Smash may be the fan favorite, but I think if you look now, it's worth noting that 3 of their top 5 most streamed songs are from this album. Which personally, I kind of question why. This album is best known for the song Pretty Fly for a White Guy, which I understand is an ironic song, it's a self-parody, whatever, but still, this is one of the most irritating songs of all time to me.
And all the girlies say I'm pretty fly for a white guy.
But who really gives a shit what I think, right? Because regardless of my personal opinion, this song was a gigantic hit. It's super catchy, it was a huge song, it went to number 1 in I think like 9 or 10 countries. Most of them in Europe, which I think validates everything that I've ever said about Europeans and their terrible taste in music. This album was also the first time where I'd say that they really changed up their style a bit. Up until this point, they'd really continued to play pretty straightforward Southern California style pop punk that, other than better production, really didn't sound all that different from their first album. But with this one, they went, I guess you would say, a little bit more pop, added in some sort of other elements like different kinds of percussion and stuff. Personally, I think this album is a little bit more corny and cartoonish than their earlier stuff, but I can also recognize why it's their most accessible. For example, like the horns and percussion in Why Don't You Get a Job? They also got a pre-fame Zooey Deschanel in the video for She's Got Issues, dressed like she is Ramona Flowers. Very 90s look. They also started to do more kind of larger pop culture stuff, which I get the sense that they kind of sort of resisted a little bit before. Like, if you notice, they never did the whole late night talk show circuit that a lot of bands did, which I'm sure they had lots of offers for. For example, they were on the soundtrack to the game Crazy Taxi, which I remember playing a ton on Dreamcast until I just got absolutely sick of their song, but it was a great game. They also had a cameo in the movie Idle Hands, the kind of horror comedy movie with Seth Green and Jessica Alba, where Dexter gets his scalp ripped off by a disembodied hand while wearing an AFI shirt. And speaking of AFI, this is also when Nitro Records really came into its prime, which is a label founded by Dexter and Greg from the Offspring in 1994, and had bands like Rufio, Guttermouth, and Jughead's Revenge, and most notably also put out everything from AFI up to and including the All Hallows EP. Basically all of the punk era AFI releases. And for sure, AFI AFI was going to be big regardless of what label they were on because they're just that good and the guys in the band are that smart. But at the same time, the fact that Nitro was able to use the Offspring's platform to give them a little bit of a boost had to help, right? For example, him wearing their shirt in Idle Hands, or the Offspring covering AFI on the soundtrack for the Jim Carrey movie Me, Myself, and Irene.
This rage I cannot let go. Feeling high, feeling high.
And of course, as most of you know, AFI went on to be one of the most important bands of the 2000s and themselves did a ton to help the punk and hardcore scene. So again, I think you have to kind of give the Offspring some of the credit there for facilitating that to some extent. Nitro also put out a ton of classic punk bands like TSOL, The Damned, and The Vandals. And if you look at what the label has put out, it seems pretty clear to me that their goal was never really to like make a ton of money. It was really just to put out what they thought were great bands. And the money they made and the platform that they had with the Offspring really was just a way to help facilitate that. Nitro doesn't really get a ton of credit for it, I don't think, but honestly, they were one of the best labels of the 90s. Which brings us to what I would call the end of the Offspring's most relevant era, with Conspiracy of One from 2000. This one doesn't seem to be very popular with the fandom, but if I personally had to choose one Offspring album to listen to, I think it would be this one. Because to me, it's the one that sounds the most like a typical 90s Fat Records or Epitaph band. Like some band you would see play with Good Riddance and Pulley or something. I don't know if it was a conscious decision or just kind of worked out this way, but it seemed like they dropped most of the like goofy, cartoonish kind of stuff from Americana, with the exception of the song Original Prankster, which I think of as kind of like Pretty Fly Part 2. It's honestly a really good album.
Until the break of time, life cannot go by the letter. Time, Prozac can make it better.
And although the band never went away and of course continued to do well, they put out several more albums, including one that actually just came out last year that I didn't even know about until I made this video. I think after this album, they were clearly past their prime, both commercially and in terms of their relevance. So I'm just kind of gonna lump all that together. And by the way, that is not a criticism. Like, it happens to literally everyone because nobody can stay at the top forever, right? So that brings us to the last question. What is their lasting impact, influence, and legacy? Well, on the one hand, I don't really hear a lot of people mention the Offspring as a direct musical influence like you do Green Day. Like, I don't hear a lot of people say, oh, the Offspring, that's the band that inspired us to start playing music. But on the other hand, with tens of millions of albums sold, like, I'm sure there are plenty of people who would say exactly that. But to me, their influence is more about what Brett from Epitaph said, that they raised the sea level for punk as a whole, along with Green Day and Rancid. Like I said, in particular for that Southern California style, which in hindsight ended up being by far the most important and influential version of punk, at least in the mainstream sense. I think their success also paved the way for that late 90s and early 2000s pop punk explosion, the what I call TRL bands like Newfound Glory, Blink-182, and Sum 41. And I say that because if you actually take a step back, I think that both sonically and culturally, they were a lot closer to those bands than Green Day were, who really seemed like they wanted nothing to do with any of that. Like, they almost thought they were too good for it. And personally, although I don't really love their music, I've always appreciated that they seem like really humble, chill, smart guys. For example, Dexter going back to school to finish his PhD in molecular biology in 2017, which obviously he didn't need to do. He's already rich and famous. It's not like he's gonna go work in the field. It's just that he seems to really love the subject and love education, and he wanted to pursue that, which I think is pretty cool. And really, in hindsight, maybe more than any of those other 90s bands, they really never walked away from punk as a sound or a culture. And think of how many millions of kids got into punk because of them. So next time you think of bands that made a real contribution to punk, make sure that you have the Offspring on that list. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments of this video. Also, as always, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get every one of my podcasts a week early. I do Q&As, I do giveaways. There's a way to have me review your music, artwork, or anything else you want to have my eyes and ears on. I do a call for submissions every month. All you got to do is just drop your stuff in the comments of that post, and then I will review them on Twitch, post it on Patreon for everyone to see. So if that sounds cool, there's a link to that in the description of this video. And with that, I will sign off for now, but I will see you next time.